The Khajiit hail from a distant land called Elsweyr, bordered on the north by Cyrodiil, and the south by the glistening blue waters of the sea. Elsweyr is an arid land of deserts and rocky canyons, where the sun shines warmly, always. They're a city so ancient, the sands have swallowed them whole. But now I will say no more, for I miss my home greatly.
From the shores of Somerset, a crew of brave mer-mariners set out in search of lost Aldmeris. The ancestral home of the old Elnathe was a distant memory now. Topal saw it in his dreams, shrouded visions of a beautiful but very strange land. Lucid now, Topal stood at the helm, the greatest pilot of those elder days. The waystone pointed northeast, the anchor was raised, the sails were unfurled, and the elven explorers embarked on an expedition that was to last for 80 moons. For 66 days and nights he sailed, over crashing waves of dire intent, past whirlpools, through mist that burned like fire, until finally land was spotted from the crow's nest. These sprawling shores did not belong to old Aldmeris, but to an even more sublime continent, Dawn's beauty, Tamriel. Many oddities were spied from the deck of the Niben as the elves charted the coastline. Goblins and birdfolk, lizard people and screaming bat dragons. But the most striking discovery of all to Topal the pilot was found along the banks of the river that would soon adopt the name of his ship. The cat demons of 4 legs and 2 kept the vessel locked in their keen feline gaze. They hissed and spat and roared at the white gold-skinned invaders. Through Topal's high elven eyes, these cats seemed savage. Their hatred for the Aldmer could not be rational. It was a bestial, indifferent kind of malice, innate to the uncivilized creatures of the wild. But the pilot was wrong, for these cats were intelligent, and on a spiritual level, they were fundamentally opposed to any sapient beings proudly following the figurehead of Auriel the Eagle. After discovering the isle at the centre of Lake Rumer, the Niben set a course for Somerset. They had failed in their search for old Aldmeris, but the new land they had found was full of life and wonder, and Topal knew his kind would return to the shores of Dawn's beauty, to instate the malefic era of the elves. While the superior high elves searched in vain for their forgotten home, the catfolk humoured no such delusions. They luxuriate in the warm sands and humid forests of Elsweyr, comforted by the knowledge that their place in this world was as clear as the purest crystals of moon sugar. While the other races warred over land and religion, the cats endured, guided by the constancy of the moons arcing overhead. But beneath their seemingly laid-back dispositions lies an immense amount of responsibility. Elsweyr has a long and troubled history, and as the oral traditions assert, the Khajiit are Fadamai's greatest gift. For when the gods fail, it falls upon them to restore the cosmic balance. There is much more to the catfolk of Elsweyr than meets the eye. To dismiss these felines as mindless beasts is folly. In a land dominated by men and elves, it's all too easy to overlook the Khajiit. But today we're going to explore them in great detail, from their complex culture to their tumultuous history, from their unique view of the gods to their crucial role in maintaining the fabric of the Mundus. Be warned, traveller, great darkness lies ahead. Welcome to Elsweyr. After what felt like an eternity amidst the dusty parchment pillars of Apocrypha, I returned to my tower to resume my daedrology, but my mind was fatigued from the cosmic weight of Mora's forbidden knowledge. So, here I am, venturing into Greater Tamriel in an attempt to ground myself in reality. I came upon a roving troupe of Khajiiti traders and tall tale tellers. Oral traditions are a crucial part of Khajiiti culture. Their moon singers are renowned storytellers, while their clan mothers garner immense social status for their aptitude in disseminating cultural myths. So respected are clan mothers that they maintain autonomy from the main of Elsweyr. Beneath the swollen moons, I stumbled upon their camp, a moth drawn to the flame of mirthful conversation. They beckoned me, and I gratefully joined them. Hairless scholar they called me, though not quite so hairless as most men, given my face whiskers. They saw my quill and journal and permitted me to join their humble caravan, so long as I was willing to sleep beneath the stars every night and promised to chronicle their spoken tales and histories. The tale I'd interrupted with my arrival had seemed ominous, but they told me that that story would have to wait. Instead, they chose to tell me about the intricacies of their race. Such skilled storytellers these cats were. It was as if the moons and stars above drew nearer and shined brighter, mingling with the incandescence of the campfire, which crackled contentedly, to craft an atmosphere of indescribable tranquility. Unlike the catfolk, hairless ones love immortalizing words in writing, and they'll do so confidently, veritability be damned. The Pocket Guide to the Empire, perhaps the most well-known encyclopedia in Tamriel, which has seen multiple editions, each more accurate than the last, gives us some insight on the Khajiit of Elsweyr. The first edition states, Elsweyr is inhabited by a strange race of intelligent beastmen, who call themselves the Khajiit in their native tongue. These Khajiit are all feline in aspect, some far more than others. The third edition elucidates, adding some doubt to the prior assumption. Khajiit are commonly considered one of the beast folk, one of the few survivors of the original inhabitants of Tamriel, before the coming of Mer and Man, and Elsweyr is their home. This tradition is not, of course, accepted by one and all. Alternate theories abound about their origin, based mainly around the fact that one of the breeds of Khajiit, the Rat, so closely resembles the elven folk that they could be cousins. Some believe that the Khajiit are simply descendants of the original Aldmeri settlers in Tamriel, who evolved like the Altmer, Bosmer, Dunmer and Orsimer because of circumstance into the cat-like race that walks the dunes of Elsweyr. If so, they are just one more of the alien sentient species who have made themselves so much a part of Tamriel to be confused for natives. My Khajiiti hosts can barely retain their laughter when reading about their kind through the eyes of men. But as I discovered, there is far more to them than meets the eye. The cats would not consider themselves beasts any more than they consider themselves elves. Their myths tell that they derive from the same spiritual stock as the old and wandering Elnefey, but instead of gradually devolving into men and mer, they were purpose-built by the mother of all cats, Azura. They were designed to be in tune with the mortal realm, and that is why they feel the motions of the Mundus and the moons in the sky, far more than any other mortal race. To understand this, we must understand the most widely accepted tale of the Khajiiti creation story, popularized by the famous clan mother Anisi. The creation myths for most Tamrielic cultures can be found summarized in the Monomyth and the Anuat. These myths speak of Anu and Padamai, order and chaos, stasis and change, and their violent, passionate interplay. This interplay creates complexity, light and darkness, and leads to the foundation of time. With such a rigid structure in place, the lost spirits had a point of reference, and were able to form themselves. The Khajiit creation story is similar in many ways to this archetypical pattern, with some key distinctions. Firstly, unlike say the Ultima version of the myth, the Khajiit view Padamai, the force of chaos, as the sympathetic character, rather than the devious, destructive one. They also don't bother to come up with the distinction between Adric and Daedric, not wasting too much thought on who should be considered an ancestor god. Sheogorath's Chamberlain Haskell offers some choice words on this difference. Ah, the cats. I've never liked cats personally, but the mad god enjoys their company. I suppose because they're inexplicable and unpredictable. I am told that the Khajiit revere both the Aedra and the Daedra, worshipping whichever divine seems most applicable to whatever they're praying for or swearing by. This divergence in mindset leads to an intriguing interplay of original spirits. Many who are overlooked for their Daedric nature by others are embraced by the catfolk. Anisi says, "In the beginning there were two littermates, Anur and Fadamai. After many phases, Fadamai said to Anur, 'Let us wed and make children to share our happiness.' Together, Anur and Fadamai reared two litters. Among them were gods like Alkosh, the cat king of time, and Kanafi, the goddess of winds, who carries the souls of dead Khajiit to the sands behind the stars. We'll discuss the manifold spirits born from the first 2 litters in detail later in the video, but the focus of Anisi's tale is the controversial final litter. You see, after the second litter, Anur announced that 2 is enough, for too many children will steal our happiness. But kittens are playful, and yearn for attention as they do their mother's milk. So, Kanafi came to Fadamai and said, "Fadamai, mother, Kanafi grows lonely so high above the world, where not even my brother Alkosh can fly." And Fadamai's maternal devotion led her to commit a great deception, perhaps because cats are the best deceivers. Fadamai tricked Anur into making her pregnant again. The children of this final litter would each become crucial in mortal affairs, and especially so for the Khajiit. Anisi continues, "Fadamai gave birth to the moons in their motions, and she gave birth to Nirni, the majestic sands and lush forests. And she gave birth to Azura, the dusk and the dawn. And from the beginning, Nirni and Azura fought for their mother's favour. The throes of childbirth resonated across the orbis, and before Fadamai had finished giving birth to her final litter, Anur found her. His wrathful hiss rivaled her birthing cries, and Anur struck her. Fearing for the safety of her unborn kittens, Fadamai fled to the only place that would provide a respite from Anur's incandescent ire, the great darkness, the void. It was in this lightless expanse that Fadamai gave birth to her dark runt, Lorkhaj. But the void is no place for a spirit so young, and his heart, a vacuum made for his mother's love, soaked in the great darkness until it was full. It was then that the great darkness learned its name, Namira. The tale of Lorkhaj and Namira is far from over, but we shall come back to that in due time. The labour had sapped what little strength remained within Fadamai, and she knew her time was near. So she spoke to her newborn kittens, giving them purpose. As Anisi recounts, Fadamai said, "Jakajay, to you Fadamai gives the lattice, for what is steadier than the phases of the moons? Your eternal motions will protect us from Anur's anger." And the moons left to take their place in the heavens, and Anur growled and shook the great darkness, but he could not cross the lattice. And Fadamai said, "Nirni, to you Fadamai leaves her greatest gift. You will give birth to many people as Fadamai gave birth today." When Nirni saw that Azura had nothing, Nirni left smiling, and all Fadamai's children left except Azura. And Fadamai said, "To you, my favoured daughter, Fadamai leaves her greatest gift. To you Fadamai leaves her secrets." And Fadamai told her favoured daughter 3 things. And Fadamai said, "When Nirni is filled with her children, take one of them and change them. Make the fastest, cleverest, most beautiful people, and call them Khajiit." And Fadamai said, "The Khajiit must be the best climbers, for if Massa and Secunda fail, they must climb Kanafi's breath to set the moons back in their courses." And Fadamai said, "The Khajiit must be the best deceivers, for they must always hide their nature from the children of Anur." And Fadamai said, "The Khajiit must be the best survivors, for Nirni will be jealous, and she will make the sands harsh, and the forests unforgiving. And the Khajiit will always be hungry and at war with Nirni." And with these words, Fadamai died. Up to this point, every one of Fadamai's children had been given a gift. The only exception was lost Lorkhaj. As we'll explore soon, Azura knew of Lorkhaj's dark duality, but her siblings did not. So when Nirni came to Lorkhaj for help, she was unaware of the mixed blessing she was about to receive. After many phases, Nirni came to Lorkhaj and said, "Lorkhaj, Fadamai told me to give birth to many children, but there is no place for them." And Lorkhaj said, "Lorkhaj makes a place for children, and Lorkhaj puts you there so you can give birth." But the heart of Lorkhaj was filled with the great darkness, and Lorkhaj tricked his siblings, so that they were forced into this new place with Nirni. From here, Anisi's tale follows a similar trajectory to the well-known myths. Some of Fadamai's children escaped, becoming the sun and stars. Others sacrificed themselves to stabilize Nirni and provide her the support she needed for giving birth. Those who endured with any semblance of their former strength punished Lorkhaj. The children of Fadamai tore out the heart of Lorkhaj and hid it deep within Nirni, and they said, "We curse you, noisy Lorkhaj, to walk Nirni for many phases." Lorkhaj's trap was soon forgiven, at least by Nirni, because even though this place was full of limitation, it allowed her to give birth to her many children, and it was protected by her siblings, Joan and Jode, the moons and their motion, the Jaka J. Nirni found her silver lining, but it was soon spoiled by her rival sister Azura, who was beloved by the other kittens of her litter far more than she. And to make matters worse, Nirni was about to learn of Fadamai's gift to Azura. While struggling to find the right shape for the forest people of Tamriel's south, Azura offered Nirni assistance. Azura came to her and said, "Poor Nirni, stop your tears. Azura makes for you a gift of a new people." Nirni stopped weeping, and Azura spoke the first secret to the moons, and they parted and let Azura pass. And Azura took some of the forest people, who were torn between man and beast, and she placed them in the best deserts and forests on Nirni. And Azura, in her wisdom, made them of many shapes, one for every purpose. And Azura named them Khajiit, and told them her second secret, and taught them the value of secrets. And Azura bound the new Khajiit to the lunar lattice, as is proper for Nirni's secret defenders. Then Azura spoke the third secret, and the moons shone down on the marshes, and their light became sugar. To the forest people, Ifri is the god of the green, of songs and stories. He is the shaper of Nirni, but he was an enemy of Azura and the Khajiit. He snuck in behind Azura when she parted the moons, and told Nirni that Azura's aid was but another trick, worse even than Lorkhaj's. Lorkhaj might have imprisoned them all, but he hadn't dared to meddle with her children. So, Nirni made the deserts hot and the sands biting, and Nirni made the forests wet and filled with poisons. But Azura's cat elves were well prepared for all the trials and tribulations the other gods could throw at them, because they were unique. They were the fastest, cleverest and most beautiful. They were the best climbers, deceivers, and most importantly, the best survivors. And so, the Khajiit came into existence, hailing from the same genetic stock as the forest elves. And their homeland too was born, a diverse and wondrous land, but full of perils. Elsweyr, the home of the catfolk, jungled and tropical in the south, vast and barren in the north. Their primordial wood-elven siblings dwell to the west in Valenwood, the Heartland elves and the imperial humans to the north in Cyrodiil. The deserts of Anequina forged a hardened warrior culture. The absence of fertile soil led these cats to view their Southron neighbours as decadent and depraved, prone to the temptations of tricky spirits like Sangin, whose urges of blood and pleasure blind the Khajiit from Azura's radiance. Alternatively, the rainforest-dwelling felines of the south enjoy all the wonders of nature, getting rich and very intoxicated on the bountiful sugar that grows in the marshland. I had shared my supply of northern ale with the vagrant cats, and when combined with the silken voices of these storytellers, and perhaps also the fish that had been generously seasoned with moon sugar, we began to feel quite tipsy. For a moment, we all gazed in synchronicity at the firmament above. The full moons had reached their apexes, and so I asked them about their shapes. On this night, they told me, many a Sench would be entering the world, for those hefty quadrupeds took their forms when both Massa and Secunda were full, or Jode and Joan as the cats called them. The phases of the moons are fundamental to every aspect of life in Elsweyr, and it all begins at birth. There are 8 distinct variants of Khajiit morphology, with another 8 larger subvariants possessing the Rat suffix. When Massa is waning and Secunda is full, the smallest of the firstocks is born. This firstock is named Alfiq, and to the eyes of hairless ones, they appear much like common house cats. But their intellect should not be underestimated, for many wise clan mothers have taken this shape over the eras. Even the crooked cat god has been known to take on this most noble form. In order of size, the next Furstock is the Dargi cat, born when Massa is waning and Secunda is new. The Dargi appear more like the typical Khajiit seen outside of Elsweyr, only they are lithe and nimble, perfectly designed to dwell in the jungles. For when Nirni made the rainforests of Elsweyr, she flooded the understory and populated it with perilous creatures. Thus, Azura made the Dargi and the Dargi Rat to thrive in this environment, living amidst the high branches where the hazardous flora and fauna and those bothersome Bosmer could not reach. Back down on the ground, born when Massa and Secunda are both new, we have the Sufi Khajiit. The Sufi and Sufi Rat are similar to the races of men and Mer in size and stature, but have digitigrade legs, making traditionally designed boots a nuisance. Little is known of the Tojai and the Tojai Rat, but they are most similar to the Sufi and Sufi Rat. I won't continue to list all the moon phases, for it's pretty clear how important the role is they play. The most common Furstock, and the kind I am sharing this campfire with, is the Cafe and Cafe Rat. These cats also share similarities with the previously mentioned bipeds, but for the fact they possess plantigrade legs, making them the most suitable for assimilation into human and elven societies. The Palmer and Palmer Rat are like Cafe, only much larger and built for battle. They are much more akin to tigers than typical cats. Even more substantial in size, there is the quadrupedal Sench and Sench Rat. Nicknamed battle cats, these breeds can even be effective mounts. Of course, one would need to acquire consent first, for these cats did not sacrifice intelligence for size. The key reason they are rarely seen outside of Elsweyr is due to the fact that the other races have a tendency to mistake them for savage, untamed beasts. The penultimate Furstock is one of the more peculiar breeds. The Ohms and Ohms Rat are only lightly furred, and in some cases grow no perceivable fur at all, but for the hair on their heads. The Ohms in particular don't even have tails, and are an affront to high elven perceptions of the distinction between elf and beast. One look at an Ohms Khajiit could make even the most xenophobic Ultima reconsider the choice to label them beastfolk. The existence of Ohms Khajiit really lends credence to the creation story posited by Clan Mother Anisi, for it makes the kinship between the Bosmer Forest Elves and Azura's elves all the more plausible. This dependence on the phases of the moons means that the Khajiit have an unparalleled affinity for the firmament, and as we'll discuss later in the video, to meddle with the natural rhythm of the cosmos is to disrupt the circle of life for the catfolk. This connection makes the Khajiit inherently chaotic beings, padomaic in nature. They are not so focused on Anu's blinding brightness, but rather the forces of twilight and of darkness. The goddess of dusk and dawn, the herald of night and day, whose sphere is closely tied to the moons and their motions, is of course a crucial figure to the catfolk. The moons are believed by some to be the flesh divinity of lunar Lorkhaj, and the fabled third moon, the dark moon, brings with it the threat of Nemira, the devouring darkness of the void. There is much to expand on here, and it all ties into that one final Furstock we have yet to mention, the Mane. My Khajiit companions had described the various Furstocks to me as we travelled along their trade route from Whiterun to Markarth. They told me of their friends back home, friends of all shapes and sizes, as well as former lovers, even their parents, with Kayla attributing her strength in battle to her Sench mother. I would have recounted all of their anecdotes for you right here, but there was only so much space in my journal, and some conversations are best savoured in the haze of memory. It was only when we made camp again, when the moons were obscured by the clouds and a complete creeping darkness had swaddled us, driving us closer to the fire, that I asked them the fateful question. This question revealed something in these cats that had been hidden by their mirthful, mellow demeanours, a darker side that dwelt within every one of them. I asked them about the hidden moon. It is very rare, but when Jode and Joan align in such a way, with Joan eclipsing Jode, a third moon appears in the night sky. This moon is given many names: the dark moon, the dead moon, the hollow moon, the ghost moon. Whatever you choose to call it, the significance of it to the Khajiit is potent. No wonder then that the spiritual leader, the Main, is born under this seldom seen alignment. I would have to probe deeper over the coming nights to get the cats to elaborate on this moon, but they told me about their mains throughout their history, and Clan Mother Anisi's tale about the birth of this moon. The Main is not exactly a fur stock, in that it is physiologically different to the other breeds. What makes the Main unique is spiritual. It is said that only one Main can live at any given time, and that each new Main is just a reincarnation of the last, manifested in a different body. Of course, being a human scholar, I was skeptical of this claim. Many leaders, particularly those endowed with big, bulging egos, tend to decry themselves as one of a kind, chosen by their god or gods for the divine purpose of living lavishly at the apex of the societal lattice. By deposing all rivals and silencing all dissidents, the natural next step would of course be to create a cult of personality, misattributing one's success as a preordained inevitability. But it was not my place to interject this to my hospitable hosts. And to be fair, of all the Tamrielic races, the Khajiit tend to be the least ambitious and egotistical. There are many myths and folktales surrounding these spiritual leaders. The Pocket Guide 1st edition mentions one strange tradition. In olden times, the Khajiit would shave off their own manes in deference to the Main, braiding them into locks that he would incorporate into his own gigantic mane. Over time, as the population of the region grew, this ritual became impractical. Now, while all Khajiit still remove their manes, they do so largely as a symbolic sacrifice. The current Main still wears the hairlocks and braids of his own tribe, as well as those of his warrior guard, which encompasses hundreds of Khajiit. He is so weighed down by the hair of his kinsmen that he cannot move without aid, and often travels about the countryside by means of palanquin. This tradition may seem ludicrous, but the heavy impractical attire is an effective symbolic gesture from the leader to the masses that the Main carries the weight of responsibility on his back, that to protect his own pelt is to protect all the people of his kingdom. But the role of the Main goes far beyond the symbolic, for these spiritual leaders are champions of Azura, born for the transcendental purpose of safeguarding the moons and climbing the lunar lattice in times of strife. Clan Mother Anisi relayed Fadamai's words to Azura, and Fadamai had said, "The Khajiit must be the best climbers, for if Massa and Secunda fail, they must climb Kanafi's breath to set the moons back in their courses." And while this purpose is not unique to the Mains, it is the Main who ultimately takes on this astronomical responsibility. We'll touch more on these cosmic threats later, for there is much still to discuss about this lattice and the spirits of the Orbis. But these Mains also lead the Khajiit within the Mundus, and act as a great unifier to prevent excessive infighting. Elsweyr serves as a perfect contrast to Cyrodiil, despite Alicia's covenant with Akatosh, keeping the liminal barrier between Oblivion and Mundus safe, a barrier which is synonymous with the lattice. The Heartland has always been plagued by avarice and ambition. Petty lords and feuding kings are constantly vying for the Ruby Throne, whenever the Dragonblood monarchs die. But by placing their faith in a higher power, an infallible system of supernatural predetermination, the Khajiit can more easily resolve conflicts over governance. A noteworthy example of one of these Mains is the legendary Riddle'Thar Epiphany, whose revolutionary ideas caused a renaissance in the province. So effective was his regime change that his epiphany achieved a form of apotheosis, being immortalized as the Riddle'Thar, the deity embodying the cosmic order. To fully understand this epiphany, let's take a look at how the Khajiit structure their society and allocate power. For the bulk of recorded history, up to the late First Era, Elsweyr was divided into 16 kingdoms. Imperial sources contradict each other on how hostile or harmonious the Kingdoms of Elsweyr were. The first edition of the Pocket Guide describes Elsweyr as a place of nearly constant insurrection and tribal warfare. The third edition, however, states, "In the early First Era, there were 16 independent realms in Elsweyr. Unlike typical human and elvish kingdoms, these regions did not compete with one another for land and power. Earlier versions of this guide spoke of tribal conflict, but the truth was quite the opposite in the earliest Khajiit society. Recognizing their own idiosyncratic characters and strengths, each territory specialized in one specific duty, supplying its neighbors with its bounty in exchange for equal measure. The key reason for this relatively peaceful society is the indelible motion of the moons. The marks they made on the night sky were consistent, reliable, free from the fluctuations of mortal minds." The guide continues, "The dominance of each region was checked by the moons. It was said that when both moons were full, Nekinal was in dominance. When both moons were half, Torval. When both moons were new, Senchal. The other regions too had their days of power and influence. This system is largely responsible for the nonchalant reputation of the catfolk. Free from excessive infighting, they were much more effective in uniting to fend off outsiders. The Elysian Empire, even in its peak, didn't overreach into the northern deserts of modern-day Anequina, and even the ancestral adversaries of the cats, the Bosma, were hesitant to extend their jungled domain into the fertile rainforests of present-day Palatine. It took a planetary catastrophe to unravel this effective system of governance. The Thrashian plague ravaged Tamriel, and the contagion ran rampant in Elsweyr, decimating the population. The survivors were not numerous enough to maintain 16 codependent kingdoms, and they were forced to adapt, becoming 2 kingdoms instead, the nation-states of Nekinal and Palatine, or Anequina and Palatine in the common Cyrodiilic tongue. 16 kingdoms was perfect. Joan and Jode each had 8 phases, making for a total of 16. 1 phase for each furstock, 1 phase for each kingdom. But the forced societal restructuring created a bipolar Elsweyr, representing only the 2 extremes. The guide proceeds to say, the 2 kingdoms, of course, represented the moons at their extremes, but also radically different interpretations of Khajiit culture, which they adopted from the tribes each had absorbed. The people of Palatine considered their neighbours in Anequina to be uncouth barbarians. Meanwhile, the Anequinians looked to the south and saw only decadence and depravity. For many more centuries, the 2 lands fought, neither gaining appreciable ground. The south had the wealth and could hire mercenaries and withstand sieges, but the north had a warrior culture and could never be dominated. And this set the stage for the Main to step in. It fell upon the shoulders of Riddle'Thar Epiphany to set Elsweyr back on a harmonious course. There had been other attempts to alleviate Elsweyr's troubles, such as in Second Era 309 with the marriage of King Kiergo of Anequina and Queen Ashita of Palatine. This border-breaking union brought about the first Elsweyr Confederacy, and this was the first time the name Elsweyr was used for the province as a whole. But this marriage did not remedy the root problem. Consolidation was at the core of the discord, so further consolidation from 2 kingdoms to 1 was obviously not going to work. Tribal leaders still maintained power at a local level, and inspired far more loyalty from the common cat than the king and queen ever could. Before long, these lesser chieftains forgot their ancient sugar vendettas and joined forces against the Elsweyr Confederacy. Anequina fell to the rebel warriors, and it was only a matter of time before the entire province was torn apart by civil war. And when the catfolk needed him most, the main Riddle'Thar Epiphany had his revelation. Riddle'Thar had been making a visit to the temples of Two Moons Dance when his great epiphany came. Khajiit flocked to these temples for 2 main purposes: martial training and philosophical study. And to the cats, these aspects of their culture have a lot of overlap. Many Khajiit study martial arts known as claw dances. These dances serve as a form of self-defense, but also a form of lyrical meditation. It is a form of introspection that is best expressed through motion, verbal and physical outbursts of raw emotion. Riddle'Thar was embroiled in the throes of a claw dance when the adrenaline and lactic acid galvanized and coalesced within him. providing his active mind with a solution to Elsweyr's civil unrest. This epiphany was distilled into one policy, best described as follows. Riddle'Thar bestowed to the classes equality under the bilunar shadow, dividing their power in accordance with Two Moons' dance of the Jacane. What Riddle'Thar aimed to achieve wasn't exactly a return to the old ways of 16 independent kingdoms, but rather a new system that gave power to all parties, large and small, without allowing any one political figure to take charge. This was not going to be easy, since the city-dwelling aristocrats did not share many of the values held by the remote tribes and their less civilized chieftains. But the Main looked to the moons and their motions for guidance. He established a system in which all major parties in the province shared and alternated control over Elsweyr, based on the phases of Joan and Jode, and the Main himself would act as the overseer of this system, in what some would call a paws-off role, but others would call a thinly veiled dictatorship. Along with a new system of governance, the Riddle'Thar Epiphany revealed to Riddle'Thar the promise of an afterlife for all good Khajiit, a place called Elsweyr, or the sands behind the stars, a place of significance that will come up again very soon. The Riddle'Thar system was not perfect, and as we'll discuss more later, Elsweyr was not freed from turmoil in perpetuity. But this revelation does give us a decent idea of just how influential the Mains are in the land of the catfolk. That night, the moon sugar was potent. I felt euphoric and melancholic in acrylamide swirls of olfactory contradiction. The stars seemed to blur with imagined motion, smearing across the nebulous canvas that was the night sky. Riddle'Thar told me not to fight the hallucinations, but to welcome them like visions from Azura. For the Khajiit, the effects were said to be more profound. I had little faith in the pocket guide on foreign affairs, but I recalled reading that this sugar has a variety of uses. It is alternately a seasoning and a magical ingredient, a source of communion with the holy moons, and a dangerous and addictive drug. The Khajiit understand it to be crystallized moonlight, caught in the water of the Topal Sea, and brought to the sugarcane groves of the Thalmor by the force of the twin tides. By partaking of the sugar, the Khajiit believe they are consuming small portions of their gods' eternal souls. I didn't ask the nomads for clarification, but instead elected to sit quietly, letting the waves of joy and sorrow ebb and flow. Then, and only then, when it felt as though the spirits of the Atada had climbed down from the heavens to join us by the fire, did the cats tell me at long last about their dark moon. The mere mention of this moon made the air around us tense and sodden with meaning. To understand this moon, we must return to the creation story. In the common myths of Men and Mer, Lorkhaj is bested on the battlefield by Auriel and his champion Trinomac. At convention, atop the adamantine tower, his heart is ripped free and fired in a swooping arc across the continent. Despite the near universal reverence mortals have for their dead, we rarely see these primordial stories elaborate on how Lorkhaj's corpse was interred. We know what happened to his heart, but little else. There is an alternative hypothesis, posed by Fal Droon in his text titled The Lunar Lorkhaj. Droon writes, "We all have our favourite Lorkhaj story, and our favourite Lorkhaj motivation for the creation of Nirn, and our favourite story of what happened to his heart. But the theory of the Lunar Lorkhaj is of special note. In short, the moons were and are the two halves of Lorkhaj's flesh divinity. Like the rest of the gods, Lorkhaj was a planet that participated in the Great Construction, except where the Eight lent portions of their heavenly bodies to create the mortal planet. Lorkhaj's was cracked asunder, and his divine spark fell to Nirn as a shooting star, to impregnate it with the measure of its existence and a reasonable amount of selfishness. Massa and Secunda therefore are the personifications of this dichotomy, the cloven duality, according to Artaeum, that Lorkhaj legends often rail against. Ideas of the anima animus, good, evil, being, nothingness, the poetry of the body, throat, and moan silences the abortive, and so on, set in the night sky as Lorkhaj's constant reminder to his mortal issue of their duty. There is an immense amount of analysis we can do about this text, and perhaps the moons warrant their own deep dive in the future. But in essence, Faldrun is emphasizing the significance of duality in the orbits. Whether you look upon the universe from afar and spy the interplay between Arnur and Fadamai, or contrast the chaotic waters of oblivion, brimming with Daedric vestiges, and the orderliness of Aetherius, where well-defined souls of specific shapes and colours enter the dream sleeve. Whatever the case, we know one thing for sure that pertains to today's topic, and that's that the Khajiit do not structure their spirituality around one extreme, Anuic or Padamaic. They welcome all spirits, and are thus especially attuned to the dichotomies they provide. Generally speaking, to the Altmer, Lorkhan's role is clear. He is the adversary. To the Nords, Shor's role is also clear. He is the king of Sovngarde, the bannerlord of mankind. To the Cats, he is the cloven duality Faldrun speaks of. But let's distance ourselves from the writings of non-Khajiit for a moment, and return to the oral traditions passed down by the Cats. We already discussed the birth of the two litters, and Arnur's violent disruption of the birth of the third, as spoken by Clan Mother Anisi. But the silent priest named Amon-Dro has more to offer from this tale, about what else happened in the Great Darkness. Azura held her mother's paw in the void as she gave birth to the runt of her litter. She knew better than any of her siblings that blessed Fadamai was in the dusk of her life, and that this maternal effort would claim her. Fadamai had declared Nirni her favoured daughter before the newborn spirits, but it was at her lowest point that she discovered which of her daughters loved her the most. Clan Mother Anisi suspiciously recounts Fadamai's words to both Nirni and Azura, and her words are identical. To you, Fadamai leaves her greatest gift, but the gifts each received were vastly different. Nirni was given the gift of motherhood, but Azura was given all the secrets needed to protect Nirni. Azura was gifted nothing. She earned it. It was her love for Fadamai that revealed these secrets to her. For while Fadamai wailed, Azura wept, and the light of the lunar lattice was reflected in her tears. In his text, the favoured daughter of Fadamai, the silent priest Amon-Dro writes, Fadamai whispered to Azura 3 secrets and more. She told her daughter many things, stories of love and war and dreams undreamt, and Azura wept more to hear these things, so much that moonlight shined in the darkness. And Fadamai told Azura the names of all gates and thresholds, and the names of all the spirits, and the names of all the Khajiit that would ever live. And Azura wept more to hear how difficult their paths would be, so much that the light of her tears became one with the lattice. And Fadamai told stories of her children, and her favourite aspects of each of them. When she reached Azura, she smiled and told her favoured daughter she could not decide, and Fadamai died. Azura had followed her mother into the Great Darkness, and she achieved the impossible. The light of her love shone in the void, creating light where there was only emptiness. Azura had done the inverse of the mythic tale of Anu and Padamai. Padamai, or Fadamai, had been an obstacle for Anu's ineffable brightness to interact with. With Fadamai there could be shadows, there could be variance and novelty. A whopping yes in the face of Anu's unrelenting no. By bringing the light of her tears into the Great Darkness, Azura had recreated this primeval interplay, allowing a number of new spirits to come into existence upon Fadamai's death. Azura sat in the Great Darkness for timeless ages, musing on what she had learned and mourning the loss of her mother. Still she wept, and now the darkness fled from her tears and from the lunar lattice. She wept for so long that soon she was no longer in the Great Darkness, but in a place of moonlight and shadow. From the nothingness of the void, Azura's tears manifested as her plane of oblivion, Moonshadow. When Azura tried to traverse her great sea of tears, she saw not a formless void, but a black gate that opened into a hungering dark. In the doorway stood Fadamai's runt. The newborn spirit had been eager for its mother's milk, but had been weaned onto something else entirely. The Great Darkness seeped into his heart. Lorkhaj stood in the doorway. He was broken and bleeding, and there was a hole in his chest. But the great darkness was still in his blood, and it filled the hole where his heart had been. The dark mass beat like a heart, and black blood spilled out onto the threshold. Azura heard each beat of the heart like the beating of a drum, and each drop of blood tapped to form a rhythm she felt in her tail. Lorkhaj could do nothing against the overwhelming weight of the great darkness, compressing him with such force that his black blood turned to ebony. But Azura was the one spirit who could gaze into the darkness consuming her younger brother, and see it for what it really was. Fadamai had whispered to Azura the names of all the spirits in the Orbis, and so she saw the true name of the void. She roared in time with the song, Dra-m'Athra, Dra-m'Athra, Azura, and Azura tore out the dark heart of Lorkhaj, and all of the darkness in him came with it, and she cast it beyond the sea. And with the darkness bled from him, Azura could see her mother in Lorkhaj, and she held him until he died. Lorkhaj's heart was freed of Namira's corruption, and both hearts fell onto Nirni. His true heart landed in the east to become Red Mountain, and his dark heart sank beneath the northern snows. As we know from the words of Clan Mother Anisi, Lorkhaj made a place for Nirni's children, meaning that this realm of Mundus was his, and since the Khajiit were the most in tune with this realm, the cloven duality of its master, and the dance of the two moons, the catfolk shared in Lorkhaj's fate. Amandro writes, "From the dark heart of Lorkhaj was born the Moon Beast, the first of the Dro-m'Athra, who lurks at the edge of the lattice and knows nothing but hunger. And so, we come to the crux of the Khajiiti spiritual dichotomy. Azura saw the danger posed by the Moon Beast, by the Dro-m'Athra, so she burned what remained of Lorkhaj's body before the gate, lighting the fire with lanterns of love, Massa, Jode, and mercy, Secunda, Joan. She wept for her brother Lorkhaj, and her tears fell upon the pyre. As the ashes of Lorkhaj scattered across the lattice, even the Moon Beast became silent for a time. Then Azura dried her eyes at last, and went unto the world. Her time of grieving was over, and Fadamai had given her so much to do. For the second time, Azura's tears had secured the lunar lattice against the darkness of the void and oblivion. I mentioned before that the lunar lattice is synonymous with Akatosh's covenant in terms of the role it plays in protecting Lorkhaj's realm, and this tale from the dawn, when metaphors were made manifest, we see the construction of the lattice described much like Akatosh's covenant. Lorkhaj's body was burned, like the dragonfires burn, to keep the gate closed, and a member of the chosen race, which is Alesia and the Dragonblood rulers in Cyrodiil, or one of the Khajiit mains in Elsweyr, born in the presence of the Dark Moon, is destined to guard this gate. A deep silence befell the camp. The mere mention of that word, Dro-m'Athra, dark spirit, draped a veil of sadness over the assembled cats. I had foolishly mistaken the mood to be a fearful one, but I was wrong. It was not fear, but grief. These cats mourned those they'd lost to the darkness. I didn't say a word. This silence belonged to them, and so we sat, for quite some time, listening to the nocturnal ambience. The fire crackled sporadically, insects chirped a chorus, before stopping unanimously, and when the quiet of the fire and the bugs synchronized, we reached a deeper layer of silence. On this level I could faintly hear my heartbeat in my ears, and I thought of Lorkhaj, heart beating like a drum, each drop of blood tapping my skull to form a rhythm in my phantom tail. It was quite some time before the cats spoke again, but when they did, they told me about the Dro-m'Athra. In the words of Riddle'Thar Epiphany, Namira's darkness swirls amid our dreams and doubts. All the evils of oblivion rake their claws and gnash their fangs against the lattice, seeking to take our old souls as a prize. Be cautious, move swiftly, hide your hearts away in the thick jungles of the self, and think often of their great worth. For if you fail to hear the beating of your own heart, the beat of Lorkhaj's will take its place forevermore. Being a Padomaic society, the Khajiit share some similarities with the Dunmer of Morrowind. Boethiah taught the Changed Ones the Sigic endeavour, the pursuit of enlightenment by overcoming the tests of mortality. The catfolk have something similar in the form of the path. Cats will often talk about being lured from this path through vice or corruption. We've mentioned the motions of the moons and the lunar lattice quite frequently throughout the video, and an easy way to visualise these concepts is via the path. A lattice is a structure made from interlaced pieces of wood, the kind of thing you'd find in a garden, with vines climbing and coiling around it. The holes in a lattice provide a perforated effect, kind of like the night sky. Remember, even in the Khajiiti pantheon, the stars are holes in the firmament, ripped by the recreant Magrus and his kittens when they fled creation. And so, the sky can be seen as a lattice, dotted with star-shaped rents. And we all know what a cat will do when it sees a climbable surface. A Khajiit that climbs the lattice, or colloquially speaking, follows the path, is rewarded with the parting moons and a place in the Khajiiti afterlife. It is the sky spirit Kanafi who carries the cats on her wings to be judged by Azura at the Moongate. But even with this divine chaperone, there is no guarantee of entry. Those cats who live pure lives, untainted, uncorrupted, will find themselves in the sands behind the stars, where the dunes are made of sugar, and they'll embrace warmth without end while they await the next pounce, aka the next cowper. But there is a parallel place, governed by Namira, the dark behind the world. No warmth or succour, no anything at all. In the words of Moon Bishop Hunal, in his text titled Trail and Tide. A true cat may stumble, may lose his way among the deep woods, and come upon the temptations of a darker dance led by the frightful heart. Fear may seize the soul, confuse the mind, and baffle the senses. All Khajiit strive to be true cats, to avoid the bent dance, becoming bent cats, Dro-m'Athra. In another text, Littermates of Darkness, Moon Bishop Hunal writes of the bent cats. These then become the dancers in the darks, where they whirl to no music but the beating of the heart. Sometimes these dancers seep up through the cracks in Nirni to the moonlit world, and walk among us as if made of moonless night. Then we call them Dro-m'Athra, and this is a name of fear. For a true cat to see a Dro-m'Athra do the bent dance is to feel his tail twitch in time, and feel the pull of the darks. As each twitch pulls the true cat further from the moon's light, the cat's shadow grows longer and more bent. And if the tide of the darks grows greater than the tide of the lights, the true cat is lost, and becomes a bent cat. While the Khajiit venerate a variety of spirits, regardless of whether they would be considered Adric or Daedric by men and Mer, they do categorise them based on their relationship with the cats. There are the sky spirits, dark spirits, worldly, wandering, and adversarial spirits. We've talked about the sky spirits in some detail already. The worldly spirits include Nirni, Ifa, and Hircine. Some cats believe it was Hircine who fathered Nirni's first litter, giving the Khajiit their bestial forms. For more information on the love triangle between Nirni, Ifa, and Hircine, I'll leave a link to my video on Hircine in the description. But in regards to the Dro-m'Athra, it is the dark and adversarial spirits that matter. Lorkhaj is unique in that he is classified as both a sky and a dark spirit, another indication of his inherent duality. Namira we know to be the name for the Great Darkness. An interesting case is Noctra. This spirit was born from the black blood of Lorkhaj at the steps of the Void Gate. When she was born, she understandably thought that she was the spirit of the Great Darkness. But she was not, for she only existed as a result of the interplay between Lorkhaj and Namira. Thus she is the spirit of shadows, and shadows do not exist without light. It took Boethra, Azura's trusted warrior sibling, to correct Noctra's mistake, for Boethra resembles truth, discipline in the face of temptation, and the following of the path. Noctra's existence is why the Khajiit are such renowned thieves. Varmina is the queen of nightmares, and she was not reared in any of Fadamai's litters, but is the spiritual embodiment of Fadamai's fear of losing her children. Because of Varmina, the catfolk are not even safe from the bent dance in their dreams, and must remain vigilant even in their subconscious minds. The adversarial spirits are notorious for besieging the lattice. Spirits like Molarg and Dagon and Meridnunda watch Nirni from outside, meowing and scratching at the door. And Orca is there too, a sworn enemy of Boethra. I quoted Haskell earlier, and he stated that the Mad God enjoys the company of the cats. His adversarial nature is not quite so deliberate and destructive as his siblings. As the text Spirits of Amon-Dro states, Shegarath, the Mind God, his fear is the mortal mind and its stability. He tests Khajiit on the path by making them doubt the truth of their own thoughts, beliefs, and actions. As you can surely tell, there is no shortage of temptation for the Khajiit, and when combined with the addictive properties of moon sugar and the forbidden refined version called skooma, it becomes clear that a place in the sands behind the stars must be well earned. Being born under the dark moon makes mains especially susceptible to the allure of darkness, and they naturally become a target of the darker, more adversarial spirits. As spiritual leaders for all Khajiit to follow, you can see why a strong-willed main is critical for the prosperity of Elsweyr. They must set an example for the catfolk, showing resilience in the face of the threats against the lattice. They may not be spoken about as often as mankind's heroes, but the mains serve a very similar purpose to Shezarines like Talos, for it falls upon them to protect Lorkhaj's creation from existential danger. Some cats born under the eclipse are not destined to become mains, yet these forgotten mains may still have a major impact on history as well. There have been instances where the role of main is not so cut and dry, as was the case in Secunda 582 with Shazar and Kali. These contenders were known as lunar champions for their service to Elsweyr and the gods. Many mains, forgotten mains, lunar champions, and other courageous Khajiit who are in tune with the moons have sacrificed themselves for the good of Jode and Joan. And despite the region's relative tranquility, numerous catastrophic events have occurred over the eras in Elsweyr, and unsurprisingly, almost all of them relate in some way to the moons. The first major example involved dragons, and took place both in the Malefic era and in the chaotic 582nd year of the Second Era. Khajiiti folktales tell that in ancient times, a hero named Kunzar-Ri encountered a dragon on Elsweyr's northern border. This dragon, named Carl-Gron-Teed, supposedly came down from the distant north in an effort to claim the power of the moons. Kunzar-Ri, the Laughing Lion, assembled a team of worthy warriors and warred with Carl-Gron-Teed and his cronies. Before the dragons could consume the moons, Zar tricked them, sapping their power and trapping them in the halls of Colossus. Kunzar-Ri's deeds saw him achieve a kind of cultural apotheosis in Elsweyr, and became known as a lunar champion in Khajiit folklore. Zar had postponed the peril, but as we all know, this is not the only time a dragon threat has been procrastinated and made the problem of future generations. The Nords did it with Alduin, and in both cases, closure was still needed. Carl-Gron-Teed returned in Second Era 582, and invaded the plain of Jode in a long-delayed effort to siphon the moon's power. Carl-Gron-Teed was thwarted by Queen Chimera and the Vestige, but this was not the end of the dragon danger. Carl-Gron-Teed's lieutenant Ladvulon continued his weakened master's ploy, with the ambition of giving Carl-Gron-Teed enough lunar power to rival mighty Alkosh. And this is where the fate of the realm fell upon a forgotten main named Jadari. In life, Jadari had been a member of Emperor Riemann Cyrodiil's personal dragon guard. She was born a main, under the eclipse, but was not destined to become the spiritual leader of the Khajiit. This loss of purpose led Jadari astray, and she was almost snagged by Namira's dark draw. To prevent herself from tumbling into the void, Jadari sought out the aid of Kanafi. She was blessed for her resilience, and was granted the Mask of Alkosh, which she was to use against Ladvulon in those ancient times before he was sealed away. Alas, as was always the case in Jadari's life, she was not the chosen one. Despite his draconic nature, Nar-Falar had sided with mortals and with the Dragon Guard, but he refused to imbue the mask with his power, so she gave her life in the effort to trap the dragons within the halls of Colossus. Her gallantry did, however, earn her a place in the highest tiers of the sands behind the stars, one reserved for Alkosh's most beloved cats. Eventually, the vestige retrieved the mask, and finally, the Red Dragon was willing to empower it. With this mask, Latvilon and eventually Kalgrontied were slain once and for all. But there is one often overlooked historical event that I'd like to talk about. For anyone who has spent any time with a Khajiit in the latter century of the Fourth Era will know just how calamitous it was in Elsweyr. No princes invaded, no wide-scale destruction was wrought, but the catfolk suffered immensely. This event became known as the Void Nights. In the 98th year of the Fourth Era, for no particular reason, Jode and Joan disappeared from the night sky. There wasn't a Daedric invasion, there wasn't a meteoric collision, they just vanished, and they remained absent for 2 whole years. It's quite incredible how this event manages to be so glossed over in the histories. Perhaps to the races of man and elf it was not such a big deal. The darkness of night would have been more complete, and the oceans would have lost their rhythm, growing much more still. In truth, the ramifications would theoretically have been far worse. Of course, the laws of physics aren't quite the same in the Mundus when compared to our universe, but with weakened tides, sea life would suffer, and the climate would shift. Without moonlight, nocturnal predators would starve, and prey animals would thrive. In 2 years, maybe city dwellers wouldn't notice significant change, but you can rest assured that the Khajiit noticed. Cultural significance aside, we know that the motions of the moons are crucial in determining the morphology of a newborn Khajiit. So, we must ponder the question, what happened to Khajiit born over this 2-year period? Remarkably, there isn't much information on the subject. I press lightly, wary of the sensitivity of the subject, but the cats were hesitant to speak of it. Perhaps that is why so little information can be found on the topic. That or another party is trying to cover it up. Were cats born during the Void Nights born as if the moons were new, making them all Suphire Khajiit? Unlikely, because the moons need to exist to be new. Gods forbid they were all stillborn. What seems more likely to me is that they were all born under the same conditions as the main, as if an eclipse had occurred and the dark moon was in the sky. The cats assure us that only one true main can live at any given time, so it's likely these cats all became forgotten mains, never fulfilling any transcendent purpose. This could have led them to become Dro-m'Athra. Whatever the case, the bent dance would have spread like a plague across Elsweyr in those days, creating a startling number of Dro-m'Athra. What I've yet to mention about the Void Nights is the potential for a major conspiracy. And when we think of major conspiracies in the Elder Scrolls universe, we tend to think of one group in particular, the Thalmor. So why would the High Elves be involved? Well, to set the stage for Thalmor involvement, we ought to look at the tale of Dro-m'Athra. This lesser-known story was overheard by a scholar when a Khajiit father was speaking to his cub. Of course, this tale may be no more meaningful than a hairball, since it's not a well-known one. But the catfolk retain most of their folklore in oral form, so it is worth hearing. Here is some of the story. The ancient Khajiit heard the great roar of Alkosh, the great cat king of time, and raced to his voice. They joined with the pride of Alkosh and were his strongest warriors. Lorkhaj, however, chose to give his roar to Ra-Wulfharth to spite the Khajiiti warriors, for he was jealous of their devotion to Alkosh. Seeing the ferocity of the Khajiiti warriors, Ra-Wulfharth could not bring himself to put them to death. Using the roar that Lorkhaj had given him, he spoke to Massa and Secunda to move to their fullness in the sky. The Khajiiti warriors became sench, but Lorkhaj stripped from them all reason. This tale goes on to describe Ra-Wulfharth's involvement at Red Mountain, where he supposedly rode a sench named Dro-m'Athra into the Heart Chamber in an effort to reclaim the heart of Lorkhaj. Lorkhaj had sided with the Nords over the Khajiit. That tale is one for another time. But there is an important message to take away from what we read. Wulfharth shouted at the sky to alter the alignment of the moons, placing both in a full state, leading to the birth of an army of Sench tigers. Make what you will of that story, it doesn't matter, for it raises an important question. If one could realign the moons, could one perform eugenics on the Khajiit? Much in the same vein as the Hist giving sap to the Argonians to change their shapes. We know from the events of Second Era 582 that Khunzar-Ri had gone to Shadowdance Temple and incited the moons to align and form an eclipse, opening a portal to the plane of Jode. Even the ESO description for Shadowdance Temple hints at the potential for these forces to be misused. Moon Bishop Hunal writes, "Had the moon priests become too dogmatic, too severe in their strictures of purity? Or were there secrets in the Shadow Dance that needed to be buried? For whatever reason, the two moons hierarchy had no choice but to close the place down. Strictures of purity. This could simply be a reference to the austerity of the priesthood, but something smells fishy to me when I hear the word purity used in a description of a place where the moons can be realigned. Maybe that's just the fish on the fire I'm smelling, or the moon sugar muddying my mind. Anyway, we have a place where the moons can be moved, and in the 1st century of the 4th era, we have a ruthless foreign political party willing to go to extremes to get what they want. In the wake of the Oblivion Crisis, the Thalmor party rose to prominence once again in Somerset, and they aim to reunite the Altmer, Bosmer and Khajiit in the 3rd Aldmeri Dominion. They backed a coup in Valenwood to secure the loyalty of the new Bosmer government, weeding out all Imperial sympathisers in the province. But Elsweyr proved harder to tame. They seemed uninterested in an alliance with the High Elves. Lo and behold, the moons vanished, and the Thalmor claimed credit for returning them. This was not the first time they had wrongfully taken credit for ending an existential threat. They did the same thing following the Oblivion Crisis. By supposedly returning the moons, the Thalmor were able to bring the Khajiit into the Aldmeri Dominion, and the stage was set for war with the Cyrodiilic Empire. Now, it's entirely possible that the return of the moons had been a coincidence, and the High Elven conspirators merely capitalized on it. But the moons don't typically disappear from the sky, and there happens to be a temple in Elsweyr that could be utilized for exactly that purpose. I think it's entirely possible that the Thalmor were behind the Void Knights. By simulating this disastrous lunar phenomenon, they not only secured the undying loyalty of the grateful catfolk, but they could also experiment with a tool capable of genetically engineering the Khajiit into super soldiers, just as Ra Wulfharth had done with Dro-m'Athra and the Sench Tigers. There is much to ponder on the topic of the Void Knights. Alas, I did not have the heart to probe further on that dark night, when the spirits of my Khajiit hosts seemed so low. The 3 iterations of the Aldmeri Dominion were not the only times the Khajiit were dragged into interprovincial affairs. Elsweyr had been brought into the Riemann Empire in the late First Era, despite having no interest in the power games of men. They were annexed again by Tiber Septim, and had consistently rebelled, to no avail. In all cases, it seemed as though the Khajiit were willing to begrudgingly submit to more dominant forces, resigned to waiting for those avaricious powers to ultimately fail, leaving Elsweyr to its own devices once more. The only noteworthy instance of Khajiiti aggression came in the 5-year war between Elsweyr and Valenwood. As we've discussed at length, these two races are ancient rivals, ever since Ifa and Azura made their marks on Nirni's litter. The war was ferocious and very bloody. The catfolk extended their borders a little, but this frivolous war soon came to an end, the main outcome being the loss of many lives. At the end of the day, Elsweyr will always be an insular place. The Khajiit are so unlike the other races of Tamriel. Whether you consider them to be elf or beast, it's of no real consequence. Culturally, they will never be conquered. Their view of the world is just too far removed from their neighbours. Perhaps the closest race to seeing eye to eye with the Khajiit, at least spiritually, would be the Dunmer. Their veneration for Azura and Boethra feature their own cultural flavour, but share many similarities. Alas, the Dark Elves are blinded by greed and xenophobia when it comes to their dealings with the catfolk, and would rather enslave them than befriend them. Can you really blame the Khajiit for keeping to themselves? As I sat by the fire for my last night with the Khajiit, I felt a great deal of gratitude. We were camped outside of Whiterun, because the Nords had united in their distrust for the cats, and had banned them from entering cities. Yet here I sat among them, welcomed like a hairless brother. I lay beneath the moons, and a star-speckled blanket of twilight. Somewhere up there, between the bloated red and silver moons, the sands behind the stars awaited these cats. And beyond that, somewhere between the dark recesses of the mortal psyche and the eternal void, loomed the dark behind the world. There is a duality within all mortals, light and darkness. Not even the sun-drenched crystalline towers of Alinor could drown out the dark, nor could the deepest dwarven minds hide from the light. To have a soul is to have the fingerprint of Anu and Padamai upon you. To be finite is to be flawed. In this regard, the Khajiit were wise indeed. There is a beast in every man and mer, yet they will reject the notion, and continue to look down upon those who appear more bestial. Maybe it's a loathing for the side of them they cannot face. The next morning I left my feline companions, and wished them safe travels on the physical and metaphysical path. And now I sit back in the familiarity of my study, with a newfound appreciation for the Khajiit of Elsweyr. I'm sure there isn't anything this video is missing. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're new to my content, please consider subscribing. And if you like taking these long walks through the lore of the Elder Scrolls with me, and have the coin to spare, consider subscribing to my Patreon, linked below. Either way, I'm thankful for every traveller who accompanies me on these journeys. My name is Drew, you've been watching Dro-m'Athra, and may your road lead you to warm sands.